Good afternoon. We are going to start at 4:05. Outside. Yeah, because they're sitting here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ITF in Focus session, presenting the Mobility Innovation Hub and its work on measuring new mobility. My name is Chang-Gi Lee, manager of the ITF Mobility Innovation Hub, and I would like to briefly introduce you to the work that we carry out as part of the initiative. For most of you, this is probably the first time you are hearing about the Mobility Innovation Hub, so I would like to give you some short overview. The Mobility Innovation Hub is one of the new programs of the ITF, which aims at helping governments to develop innovative policies for better transport in the face of uncertainty and disruption. The Mobility Innovation Hub was launched in 2022 based on the core funding provided by the Republic of Korea, for which we are very grateful. The Mobility Innovation Hub aims at helping governments managing disruption through 3 work streams: the Innovation Horizon Scan, measuring new mobility, and policy innovation, evaluation, and guidance. The Innovation Horizon Scan pinpoints which trends are likely to impact transport policies and governance in the near to mid-term and assesses the scale and scope of potential disruptions. The first Innovation Hub Scan project focuses on the impact of automation on transport sector jobs. We are also planning to have a Beyond the Horizon conference that will bring together experts within and outside of the transport sector to discuss forward-looking innovations and potential disruptions. The Measuring New Mobility series presents evidence-based analysis around innovative transport technologies and services, often called new mobility. Measuring new mobility definition, indicators, data collections is the first report from this work stream, and actually the first from the entire Mobility Innovation Hub program. The policy innovation evaluation guidance provides direct, tailor-made inputs upon request from governments or stakeholders to deliver forward-looking and actionable assessments of how public authorities can leverage innovative policies. One project addresses how cities can leverage light mobility to become more sustainable and livable. Another project explores the links between accessibility and socioeconomic status in Korea to offer insights into accessibility gaps and how to deliver more inclusive and accessible mobility. The ITF would like to grow the Mobility Innovation Hub programs further by developing more projects and activities. Please let us know if you would like to get involved with the Mobility Innovation Hub. We would welcome diversification of topics and be happy to consider other requests from member countries. To come back to the main topic of today, in this session, we dive deeper into the work carried out within the first Measuring New Mobility report. The authors' presentation and summary of their work will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Gineng Chun, team lead of Data and Policy Analytics at the ITF, on how to define and measure new forms of mobility services and the role of public-private collaboration for understanding and measuring new mobility. The ITF will keep working to meet the needs of member countries on innovative topics in the transport sector. and we hope you enjoy this session. Thank you for listening, and now I will give the floor to Ms. Raquel Poggi and Mr. Nick Harris for the presentation of the first Measuring New Mobility report. Raquel and Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Changi, and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being here. I will present now with Nick Harris the main findings of the new ITF report, Measuring New Mobility. I'm sure that everyone in this room has experienced in the last years the explosion of new mobility services and vehicles. But how can we define them? How can we measure them? And how can we integrate them in an efficient way with the traditional transport modes? So in this report, we have three main objectives. The first one is to define new mobility services and vehicles. This is the first step because to measure something, we need first to define it. The second objective of the report is to develop policy-relevant indicators to measure these services. And the third one is to explore ways to collect comparable and continuous data on new mobility services to track relevant trends and inform policy makers. Let's come back to the first objective. First of all, with the term new mobility, we refer to any intra-urban passenger mobility service and vehicles enabled by digital technology. The spectrum of services is widening in the last years, with new ones emerging very often. It is important then to define a classification system that can allow the inclusion of services and vehicles that don't exist yet today. So the classification system should be vehicle and technology agnostic. Another important thing to take into account is that the classification system should capture also other mobility options, such as public transport and popular transport. In the report, we propose a classification system of services that is based on the type of product or service delivered. We identify two major categories: ride services and fleet sharing. As you can see from in the picture, public and popular transport can be also included in this spectrum. Ride services are those services that provide the travelers with access to rides where the travel is the passenger of the vehicle and not the operator. Inside this broad category, we identified several subcategories such as ride sourcing, microtransit, and ride pooling. I will not go into details, but in the report you can find different, like all the definition and also example of these services. Fleet sharing refers to service that provide temporary access to vehicles owned by the platform. The customer operate the vehicle themselves for one or more trips and then return or park the vehicle. Inside these categories, there are like bicycle and e-bike sharing, e-scooter sharing, moped and scooter sharing, and car sharing. And here in the picture, you can see all the different subcategories with the different vehicles. We then categorize vehicles. We identified three top-level categories: micromobility, power-like mobility, and car or van-like vehicles. As you can see, we define 27 types of vehicles, but we are sure that many will come in the next years, so we will integrate them, and we think that this broad categorization can allow for new vehicles to be integrated. Services can be delivered with different vehicles, and vehicles can be used for different services, as you can see in the picture where we try to put the services and vehicles together. I will now pass the floor to Nick.
Thank you, Raquel. So as Raquel mentioned, the second goal of this project was to develop policy-relevant indicators for measuring new mobility. So we conducted a number of workshops, survey, as well as reviews of best practices in order to determine these five categories that are of most interest to policymakers when it comes to new mobility. This is sustainability, safety, utilization, accessibility, and equity. But across those five categories, we developed 17 indicators to enable two different things for policymakers. One is to quantify the wide range of benefits of new mobility in order to develop new mobility policies. and also to get an early look at some potential excessive negative externalities of new mobility and take corrective policy actions. I should note that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. There is plenty of other new mobility indicators that might be included, but it's merely a starting point for a comprehensive new mobility measurement program. And also, we recommend using some of these indicators wherever possible to measure traditional mobility modes too, in order to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of new mobility within the broader mobility system. Each indicator within the report has a purpose and recommended implementation details. The purpose involves both the policy mandate that might be involved in implementing one of these policy indicators and the policy action that is tied to this particular indicator. We really wanted to avoid doing measurement just for measurement's sake, but really tying each of these indicators to a specific action that can be taken by policymakers. The implementation details are quite specific. We include the recommended reporting frequency, the data that would be required in order to implement these mobility indicators, and also the calculation methodology and specific examples wherever available of these indicators being used in practice. So I'll dive into one example quickly just to kind of give you a sense of what's in the report. If we take indicator number 3.1, which is the vehicle utilization indicator, in this case, the mandate is to provide the mobility benefits of new mobility systems while avoiding the potential for cluttering of vehicles in public spaces. The action that could be taken in response to different values of this indicator is to restrict or to increase the size of the fleet of the new mobility vehicles in a particular jurisdiction. We recommend reporting this indicator monthly, and the data required from the operator would be the total number of trips and also the active fleet size during the reporting period. We make some notes for each of these indicators. In this case, one of the strong considerations is that certain jurisdictions will have seasonal effects for new mobility, and that should be incorporated into any thresholds that are set for policy action. And then finally, we provide some examples of these indicators that are being used for dynamic fleet size management in the United States. So each of the 17 indicators on this list here have similar levels of detail that allow them to be used for specific policy actions and with specific guidelines for implementation. So I'll pass it back to Raquel to wrap us up.
Thank you, Nick. So we are now at the third and last objective. So now, after defining the vehicles, the services, and the indicators, we need the data to calculate these indicators, and here come some big challenges. So data for new mobility service require a different approach with respect to traditional modes. Most of the data, for example, are owned by the private sector and are available mainly at the local level. So they need a different approach to report. In the report, we identify three main approaches for service providers to report data to public authorities, all with pros and cons that are better explained in the report. The first approach is that public authorities can request raw data to service providers and then decide which indicator to calculate. Otherwise, they can define before a list of indicators and ask only the required data to calculate these indicators. There is also a third possibility that public authorities can assign the task of collecting and analyzing the data to a third-party aggregator. The second aspect to consider for data reporting is data structure and format. There should be a common understanding between public authorities and service providers, a common understanding of terms, data structure, and data reporting with specific machine encodable and readable formats. And in the report, we are giving example of different format and syntax that can be used in this context. The last aspect to consider is which agreement is best suited for reporting data. For example, in some cases, private companies are obliged to report data to public authorities. In other cases, the data reporting is part of the agreement with public authorities for obtaining a license to operate in a city or in a region. In other cases, also private companies can decide voluntarily to report data if they understand the importance of doing this, and also their own benefit of doing this. So it is important for public authorities to choose the appropriate agreement based on their specific needs. And with this, we finish the presentation of the main findings of the report. You can find the report at the entrance of the room if you want to bring it home, and I will pass the floor to the moderator, Guineng Chen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raquel and Nick, for this excellent presentation. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this ITF Mobility Innovation Hub Measuring New Mobility session. So, as the speakers mentioned in the beginnings, over the past decade, we have witnessed a remarkable rise in new mobility options, so significantly changing how we travel, particularly in urban areas. Now, as we navigate through this dynamic landscape, and one critical aspect comes to the forefront, as we just heard, which is the collection and the analysis of the accurate data, through which we can then gain insights into these emerging mobility patterns and vehicle fleets, which will allow us then to comprehend and respond effectively to the new phenomena. So today we will dive into this pertinent questions that surround the measurement of new mobility issues. These are complex questions, and but we aim to shed light on these crucial issues through our collective expertise and insights, and drive the discussions towards more actionable solutions. So today, our esteemed panelists will bring diverse expertise from regulation to public policy to technology and innovation, which will enable us to gain valuable insights into these topics. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the 5 distinguished panelists today. I will go as the alphabetic order as shown on the screen. So first, I will start with my colleague, Philippe Christ, who is the Senior Advisor on Innovation and Foresight for the International Transport Forum. Philippe is an esteemed expert in transport and mobility, specializing in emerging new mobilities, technology, and innovation. And his work has encompassed many different areas, such as automation, mass, shared mobility, urban space configuration, data governance, and more and more. So with his expertise, I'm sure Philippe can offer invaluable insights into this topic. Welcome, Philippe. Now, our next speaker will be Kun-Woo Kim, who is the Chief Economist of Kakao Mobility. And Kun-Woo's work involves analyzing vast amounts of mobility data to inform economic and policy considerations and to forecast the trajectory of transportation progress. Kun-Woo also oversees the production of this annual flagship report called Kakao Mobility Report, which publishes insights from mobility data. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Our next speaker, Welmert Nijmegen. I tried to pronounce your name very correctly. Thank you. So Welmert is the head of the public policy for micromobility and car sharing at Bolt. With EU affairs experience and also a Brussels-based public affairs agency background, Welmert brings deep insights into strategic policy setting and coordination for both micromobility and car-sharing markets. So please join me in giving her a welcome to Welmert. Now, I'd like to also invite our next speaker, Karen van Klossen. Karen is the Secretary General of Polis, the leading network of cities and regions focused on urban transport innovation. So with more than 30 years of experience in the field, Karen has actively participated in urban transport network, policy initiatives, and also EU research projects. So we are privileged to have Karen with us today. Please come to the stage, Karen. And last but not the least, we have our speaker, Diana Vaquera, to join us as well in the panel. So Diana is an accomplished professional with extensive experience in the public administration of Mexico City. She is the Executive Director of Regulation of Sustainable Urban Mobility Systems of Mexico City since 2022. Diana oversees multiple different projects pertinent to this topic, for example, public bike share systems and on-street parking systems and regulation of cyclist systems, etc. So please join me in giving a welcome to Diana. So besides the distinguished speakers, we also have a special guest in the audience, Ms. Robin Chase, who is the co-founder and former CEO of Zipcar, as well as co-founder of Veniam, a network company that moves terabytes of data between vehicles and the cloud. So in 2019, she also co-founded her first nonprofit, NUMO, a global alliance to channel the opportunities represented by new mobility technologies to build cities that are sustainable and just. So Robin will then be the discussant of this session after the panel. Thanks, Robin, for being here. All right, so let me join you in the panel. Thank you once again for being with us. So as a warm-up question to all of you, we've just heard the presentation from my colleagues from this report just published a couple of weeks ago. So I'd like to hear your quick impression on this presentation in light of your expertise and experience. What are your key takeaways from these findings that you've just heard, and how do you believe this research can contribute to shaping effective policies and strengthen, the strategies for measuring new mobility? Perhaps I'll start from you, Diana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. Well, for warming up, my first impressions about the presentation is the importance of the data collecting of produced by the new mobility systems. In my case, the micromobility and bike share system and other kind of micromobility as scooters and e-bikes. The data collecting is every time essential for the creating of public regulation and public policies. So I think that's the main thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks. I think this is a very timely report. It comes at the right time for us, because also with Polis we try to help our cities navigate this innovation landscape and all these innovations, if not disruptions, coming their way, and try to also help them develop regulatory frameworks, or at least try to look at the impact of these services on the overall ecosystem. And this is why this report is very helpful as well. First of all, in terms of classifying those new types of services and vehicles, because some of them we were not catering for them because they simply didn't exist before. But also in terms of these performance indicators, because we indeed want to see how they can positively contribute to the ecosystem that we want to create, or whether they might be undermining some of the policy goals that we have. So that's also very important. And as you were saying, the third part, the data part, is really important as well. Maybe I'll come back to that later on in discussion. But cities really have to catch up when it comes to capitalizing on the huge potential offered by data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, Mos.
First of all, I think it's great to have one place where all of these services are collected and categorized, because it's so often that people ask me, but when you speak about micromobility, what is that about? Is moped sharing included, for example? And up until very recently, people didn't always know the answer, even in the industry. We were sometimes discussing this with each other. So I think it's very helpful to have that spelled out right now. The other thing that we really like to see in the report is the specific mention of utilization data. That is something that has been underestimated, I think, over the past couple of years, particularly by European cities, which is where Bolt's micromobility operations are mainly focused. We do see that that's changing, that cities are becoming more and more aware of the relevance of utilization metrics, given that a scooter or a bike that is used is not causing a clutter problem, right? And the more a vehicle is used, the more value it adds for the city. So it's great to see that recognized in this report.
Thank you very much. Kunu.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's very impressive result because it starts to try to identify the new mobility. I think it's a starting point of the make a new policy for the make a new mobility into the existing environment or market. So identification for the new mobility is a very crucial process. And I will show some new example on the Korea later. And next, the classification is also very important because I think it's just one of the important process of the making policy. Classification between new mobility or the other mobility is very important because when we mainly make clear between the new or older mobility, the policy should be changed. So I think this report stressed out about the data. I think it's also very important because nowadays a data-driven or evidence-based policy is very important around the policy makers. So, yeah, this project are very impressive in terms of that kind of things. Yeah.
Thank you. Philippe?
So full disclosure, I collaborated on this report, so I won't talk about the impact of the report. I'll talk about the inception of the report. And one of the main reasons, and Raquel and Nick talked about this, we thought this was an important report to produce, was because we have incredibly poor situational awareness around all that's happening in this space. And I'll give some numbers to help illustrate that. But I want to just say before I give those numbers that meeting the efficiency, meeting the climate, meeting the equity goals that we have to meet in the next few years will require a much more diverse set of options and a diverse set of vehicles. And this is what we're trying to illustrate in this report. So the numbers, 280,000, those are the shared micromobility vehicles in the 16 largest markets in Europe. 280,000. In France alone, last year, 1.4 million e-scooters and e-electric bikes were sold. Of course, they're used a lot less, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. But we're talking about something that is quite large and goes beyond just the services. The vehicle fleet is diversifying. 400K, just to give a counterweight, so 1.4 million electric scooters and electric e-bikes, 400,000 battery electric cars sold in Europe, all over Europe last year. So the most successful business case for light mobility or electric mobility is light mobility. And we don't have data on this, which is why we wanted to write this report. When we look at the world fleet, we know that the number of electric cars only represents a small percentage, possibly less than 3% of all electric vehicles in the world. And yet we have very little insight into where those vehicles are and how they're being used. Again, this is why we need this report. And finally, even when we look at battery electric cars, the #1 selling battery electric car in the largest global market for for all cars, but also for battery electric cars, is a car that we would hardly recognize as a car. It's in China, and it's the Wuling Hongguang Mini EV, which is a less than 660 kilo car that has a 9.2 kilowatt hour battery that is sold for $4,000. On the upper edge of what we might consider micromobility, or at least how we consider micromobility, cutting off at 350K. So diversifying world, and yet on most of this world, we have almost no oversight, hence this report.
Thank you. Thank you for providing all these excellent stats and numbers on highlighting how important this topic is and how urgent the need to really tackle this, to understand the ecosystems of the new mobility systems and how that can really contribute to wider benefits of the society. And thank you for all these positive feedbacks on this report. And just a quick note, this report is not just a one-off report on this topic, but we will have the multiple series like phase 2, phase 3 that are coming up as well, tackling different issues. And then the phase 2, we will be doing kind of like proof of concept as well on what we've already developed and proposed over here. We will put them into case studies and see what are the implications there and what can we improve in terms of what we've proposed. Great, so that's just warm up. We've all warmed up. Now let's dive into 3 rounds of discussions that I have prepared for each of you. So the first round, I'd like to sort of get your opinions on this new mobility services and regulation. This word has been mentioned multiple times, regulation. So I'd like to first discuss that with you on the contribution of new mobility services to the sustainability goals and also the need of effective regulations to really address this multiple aspects of challenges. So let me come to you first, Karen. Polis work with European cities and regions to promote sustainable mobility and transport innovation. So in your view, how do new mobility services really contribute to creating this sustainable urban ecosystem? And then how can cities really effectively regulate these kind of services to deliver such goals?
I think the extent to which these new services will or will not contribute to a sustainable urban mobility ecosystem will depend on how cities are regulating them. Because what we generally see is with innovations coming our way and being deployed on city streets is that they come with big promises, all of them, and they're all going to solve our problems. But of course, they have their own interests, commercial, we have public interests, and they're not necessarily or not automatically aligned, let's say. And that's why the governance of innovation is so instrumental, that we regulate those services in a way that we maximize opportunities, which they bring, but also mitigate possible negative externalities, which we have seen, for example, with regard to micromobility. So the governance of that innovation will be instrumental in making sure that they deliver positive outcomes. And at the same time, while we call for the governance of innovation, we have to innovate our own governance systems as well. We have to recognize that our regulatory frameworks need to become more agile, and they need to be able to factor in the unknown and not always run behind reality, but also try to be proactive. And I think that report also will help us do that, be more forward-looking and not just respond, but also be proactive in our approach. And that will be instrumental in moving forward. And we see now, while we are increasingly regulating these new mobility services, that it also comes with trial and error. Helmut, you know very well. We have a working group where we bring the cities together around a table with the shared mobility operators to see what works, what doesn't work in terms of regulatory approaches, and to go through that phase unavoidably of trial and error and learn from that and move on and again make it better. So this is the phase we are currently in, still a bit the phase of disruption, where we also have to see which modes will stay, which ones might disappear again, and which ones can help us to make that sustainable urban mobility ecosystem we're all dreaming of a reality.
Thank you, excellent points. So Diana, maybe I'll come to you now, to the Latin America context, and specifically to the Mexico City as an example. And how do the new mobility services, such as your shared bike systems that you worked on, for example, impact and improve the daily lives of cities' inhabitants? And how does your city or your government regulate such type of new mobility services to make sure these positive social impacts and values are delivered to the community?
Okay, in Mexico City's experience, the micromobility has been a complementary system for the public transport in order to democratize the access of the transport. We need to complete the first and the last mile, and so that's why a public bike share system become so successful. Nowadays, we don't consider it as complementary instead of part of the public transport. In my vision, the Mexico City citizens cannot develop their activities normally without a bike share system. The center area of the city is it's better to move by bike in order to clean not clean. I'm sorry, I'm using the the incorrect word to make space for the people in the other areas, in the foreign areas of the center, to come and to impact in the life.
And your government, and specifically your direction, have you ever done something kind of regulations in changes to really make sure that these services are actually delivering, positive social impact, enhancing accessibility or reducing CO2 emissions, etc.?
Well, yeah. In the bike share system called Ecobici, it has 13 years this year in the city. So it make a big difference in the gas emissions. Mm-hmm. That system was born in 2010 as a very innovative transport system in the city. So in that time, it has about 2,000 bikes, and nowadays we have around 5,000. Sorry, because we are in a process of renovation and expansion of the system. We are renovating all the bikes and all the stations, and we are arriving to new places, to new places in the city, right? We also has in the past the dockless system. It also only remained one team. It called DESVA. We had Mobike, I think Bolt in scooters. I'm not sure, but it wasn't certainly a very successful system. I don't want to say that micromobility system doesn't work, because actually people acquired that scooters and bikes and use it privately. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In 2019, I think, yeah, was the highest point in which that kind of system functioned in the city. Mm-hmm. There was a long variety, along the very kind of scooters and bikes, and people use it. But for some reasons, they don't last. They don't survive. Probably the pandemic. Probably. I don't want to say, but probably the regulation, Mexico City's regulation, is rough. I have to recognize it.
Thank you. So I'd like to bring this to Philippe now. Like, they both Karen and Diana mentioned about these trends that, are, some of them are just passing by, some of come and go, right? Are many of these new mobility services just a passing by trend, or are they here to stay? And also considering their potential volatilities and also impacts on the cities, what level of regulation and oversight do they really require? That Mexico said maybe that regulation was too tough. Or what type of level of regulations do you think it's required?
I don't think that Mexico City regulations were too tough. They were perhaps unfair, and I'll get to that. And unfair, I mean, in terms of what the outcome is that we wanted. So our new mobility services, a flash in the pan. Of course, in the report, we highlight there are a number of different new mobility services, ranging from micromobility to ride sourcing, et cetera. So each of those have a different pain point. Each of those have a different clearing point for being sustainable. I think we are still in early years, even for those that have been around for 10 years, and we don't have clarity on the long-term viability of many of these services. But public transport services provide a lot of essential functions. The long-term viability of public transport exists because we subsidize public transport, because it aligns with the kind of outcomes that we feel are important in cities. So I think that discussion is something that we have to start addressing. In the broader range of new mobility services, when does it make sense for public authorities to help finance the delivery of a service that provides, that reduces externalities and provides social value? And that might be something that we're already reaching in some markets. I know that Bolt has a different view on this, but I do think that eventually, I think that if we are still here in 10 years, we'll be talking about how to adjust subsidies for micromobility. That makes sense. But I think it's important not to conflate, again, new mobility and new mobility services. So the use of vehicles and the use of services. And I will say something controversial here. So you say the regulations in Mexico City were tough, and Karen, you said that cities have a role in an imperative to regulate a lot of these new mobility services. Well, when it comes to digital platforms, when it comes to digitally enabled new mobility services, I think that we regulate unfairly and unequally, and we also regulate these because it is easy to regulate them, and I'll explain that. For example, take Bolt's micro-mobility scooters. Very quickly, we said generally in the public interest it would be important to limit speeds in certain areas of the city. And so we were able to do that because, or globally we were able to do that because we could just geofence and put that regulation, put that outcome into the functioning of the operating system. But do we do that for private scooters? No. Have we even ever talked about doing that for taxi services, which is a regulated transport service, similar to micromobility in terms of the outcome? You pay for a ride, you get a ride. The vehicle is much more dangerous, but are we talking about that for taxi services? Are we talking about that kind of intervention for cars? No, we regulate unevenly. We regulate unevenly, and we do it where digital platforms exist because it is easier to regulate digital platforms than it is to regulate individual vehicles. And so that is what I mean by unfairness, and that's what I mean by the kind of biases that we have to address when we think about the overall outcomes we want to deliver. If we want more safety, if we want better access, then the regulations that we deliver for new mobility services, for micromobility, have to be aligned with those regulations that we're also imposing on the use of private individual vehicles and other types of transport services. And unless we're doing that, we're probably cutting off opportunities to deliver those outcomes in a better way, in a more flexible way, and possibly even in a less expensive way.
Excellent points. So the regulation needs to be a bit more kind of flexible in adapting to different situations for different goals and be more fair. That's the point I heard from you. So let me come to the private sector. So to Bolt first. To Waymo, how does Bolt view this contribution of new mobility services to creating the sustainable urban ecosystems? And from your perspective, what are the key considerations that you think it's in effectively regulating these services to ensure these wider societal benefits?
I'll maybe zoom in on the question of safety, and I think it's a nice bridge from what Philip just said. Because we have a bit of a safety challenge. whenever you read the newspaper these days, there's a good chance that you'll find a headline article that talks about someone having involved in a crash on an e-scooter. That's quite surprising to me because, first of all, e-scooters have been around for 5 years. And second of all, the likelihood of you dying if you're hit by an e-scooter versus hit by a car or a truck is a lot less, right? You're probably going to get more heavily injured by a truck or a car that hits you. Now, that is not to downplay the tragic accidents that do happen with e-scooters. We would very much like for those to not happen. But it is to say there's a lot more dangerous vehicles out there, but somehow we're still zooming in on this relatively minor group of vehicles. That's kind of surprising. I think that is partly driven by the fact that we still don't have any data to actually understand what's happening out there. And I think that's something we need to start solving. Now, a couple of years ago, Bolt co-founded, together with a couple of other operators, a European association called Micromobility for Europe. And in that association last year, we took the initiative to gather all the incident statistics that we as private operators gather, to aggregate that data, to get a more comprehensive understanding of what actually happens out there on the street. We've done that again this year. And the report will be published soon in the month of June, so look forward to that. We're aware that this is just a drop in the ocean. It's just the largest European operators that have come together to try and give a better understanding of what's happening on the street. It doesn't include all operators in Europe yet, although we hope that in the future we'll get there. But we're also conscious that it only provides one piece of the puzzle. Given that Philippe mentioned that there were 1.4 million e-scooters and e-bikes sold in the private market last year, just in France alone, that just makes us wonder what else is happening out there, and currently no one knows. So my call would really be, let's tackle this challenge. Let's see if we can work out a way to start gathering this data so that we really know what we're talking about, and that we can start working on effective policy measures to address the challenges that exist.
Thank you very much. How about Kakao Mobility? So we also in the beginning you mentioned, like in your reaction to the report, you mentioned about the importance of accurate identification and classifications of new mobility services, along with the use of various data indicators that will definitely contribute to the informed policy decision-making and also these optimal outcomes that can balance, the stability of the existing systems and also the innovativeness of these kind of services. Could you elaborate on this, and why do you think it's really important, this classification and identification, and how can that really contribute to the policy making?
We know Bolt, Uber these days very familiar with that. And Kakao Mobility also, I can say, Kakao Mobility is Bolt in the South Korea. And there was no Kakao Mobility in 10 years ago. And globally, there was no Uber in 15 years ago. It means that new mobility services come first, and the policy take up next. So in case of the US, there was a TNC, Transportation Network Company. They make some kind of that system to regulate the kind of Uber services. In case of Korea, after we started services in Korea 2015, but there was no regulation for our services. But it started after 2020. Government make some a platform taxi system in Korea. They introduced some new regulatory system in Korea, and they try to regulate our services from after we launching 5 years later. So before they introduced the a new regime, we are a kind of we located in the between illegal and legal like a gray area. So in that kind of a period, some people said, you guys are bad because you don't have any legal base. And some said it is very innovative because we give a new ways of movement. So after government introduce a new regime, everybody recognized it is finally legalized. So I think it means the people start to understand this kind of new mobility as it has some kind of bad point as well, but it has to the society to some. So I think that's why I said identify new mobility is a starting point of the make policy, and classifying the new mobility as into the regulation is very important, because regulation means every people in the country agree the rule of the market. That means, so after that we can we don't have our player in the market. After make some introduce a new regime, we can start to we can start to escape from the some regulatory risk. So I think that's why it's very important to understanding the new mobility in terms of the identification and the clarification. Yeah.
Excellent point. Thank you very much. Karen, let me come back to you again. You mentioned in the beginning there is kind of the digital divide, so between public and private sectors. So how can cities bridge this kind of digital gaps, digital divide between the public and private sectors to leverage data to inform this policy decisions? And how can also integrating new mobility services with public transportation systems, both physically and digitally, can bring benefits? Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
So we did a survey in 2021 to see where we are in terms of data sharing and using the potential of the data that are out there, these services which are inherently digital in nature, let's say, and how we can capitalize on that from the side of the cities. And that indeed revealed that there was a very strong digital divide between the public and the private sector. You guys having it in your DNA, and cities struggling to find out how to deal with that data in an intelligent way, let's say, because indeed just collecting all that data because it's out there, I don't think that's the smartest way to move forward. So what we're trying to do is to help them navigate that digital landscape and to identify use cases. So what data do we need for what purpose, and how can that data help us to optimize policies, to inform policies, and to enforce policies as well. And we see that this is still not being done right now. So it could really help cities to get a better idea of where these services are being used, which routes are being used, which users are using them, to enforce the regulations that they put in place in terms of parking, in terms of speed, and so on. But also to get a better idea of where to prioritize investment in dedicated infrastructure, for example. And all these things are really not happening to the extent they should be happening. And that relates to the fact that they don't have those skills in-house. So we really have to build that capacity in cities, but also help them, work together with third parties, data integrators, dashboards that are being provided by third parties that can help them interpret that data and use that data in an intelligent way. But I think to some extent they really have to internalize those skills as well, and not just, again, leave it to those third parties. That's in relation to the first point. And we do see some cities leading the way, like Amsterdam, for example. They also developed a kind of blueprint or cookbook, providing an overview of which data formats are out there and what they could be used for and which use cases could be linked to them. So that's definitely informative, and we're trying to spread that knowledge also to other cities. Coming then to your second question on integration of the different services. I mean, we need to become more multimodal and move away from the monomodal car-centric approach that we've had for so many decades. And that means that we have to make sure that all these other solutions which are more sustainable join forces as much as possible. Public transport, mass transit being the backbone together with active travel, and then new and shared mobility services filling the gaps that can never be met by mass transit, for example, and whether we're talking about remote areas or off-peak periods or target groups with specific needs. So really put that puzzle together and have those alternatives come together. We need that to happen in a physical way by providing interchanges, mobility hubs, where the different modes can be easily combined and seamlessly combined, but also in a digital way through approaches such as mobility as a service, for example. And there again, we believe that the governance of that innovation will be instrumental, because if you have a purely commercial mass, we're not necessarily going to see those modes which are the most sustainable being prioritized, but maybe the user will be seduced to use those modes that generate the most revenue if you look at it from a purely commercial perspective. Walking, for example, very valuable mode for cities, but not generating income for commercial mass providers. So then there again, that public sector oversight will be instrumental to make sure that also in the digital multimodal environment, the right modes are used for the right purpose and at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I'd like to hear also from Mexico. Do you share the similar feelings as or opinions as Karen just mentioned? So about improving this collaboration and communication of the micromobility service providers with the government, and also from your perspective, like from Mexico City's perspective, what information is useful or necessary to really develop this effective regulations of new mobility services? What do you need?
Well, I'm agree with Karen, and how we are saying before, data is essential. So I truly believe, Mexico City truly believe that in the collaboration, the government and the private area, for creating and for sharing this data. In our experience from 2018 and 2019, I don't know if we have the right enough information. We were in an very innovative kind of mobility, and we wanted to know everything, but we recognize that we cannot know everything. There's the industrial information, commercial information that has to be protected. We know and we recognize it, but we need specific data as trips, cost, benefit, public, I mean gender, age, the use, how the users use the system, for what, for the female made care travels, go to work, in the timing. Again, in our experience, it wasn't really easy to have that information from the providers, not the new mobility enterprises. Nowadays, it's more easy. The information is more fluid in order that we develop a regulation rough or unfair, but it works. It works with our two providers, the public bike sharing system and the dogless system.
Thank you very much. So, Philippe, let me come to you on this. You worked a lot with, data governance issues. You were heavily involved in this project as well. So, Diana mentioned something about, these essential data points that they need to in order to effectively regulate these services. So, how much data do we need, and what are the relevant data points needed to inform this effective policy for public authorities, at different levels, and the role of the data that's playing to achieve such kind of policy objectives?
Gining, that's a very important question. It's one that I actually wrote to you, and I'm going to take that question and answer a slightly different question, which is a more fundamental question. How do we organize ourselves to understand how much data is important, how much data is necessary? And so we at the ITF have issued a number of reports around this. One report that we issued last year called Reporting Mobility Data addresses some of these aspects, and there are two key messages there. We also just released a report looking at how to share data, and that report called Mix and Mass also addresses some of these other points I won't go into right now. Purposiveness. So that is not collecting data on purpose, it's collecting data for a purpose. We need to have a vision of what it is that transport can deliver in a city, in a country. And then we have public authorities who we mandate to carry out that vision, to help carry out that vision, to co-construct that vision. To do that, they create policies. It can be parking policy, it can be enforcement policies for speeds, it can be all kinds of policies in order to both assess the policy that they've put into place and maybe to carry out enforcement actions. They need data. Our recommendation is that the type of data and the amount of data you need for carrying out these is what should limit your ask for data. So limit the data ask to a task, and that task is a vision-based task and one that's based in policies. That is the cycle. Vision, policies and tasks, and then the data ask. And if you do that, then you can start limiting the kind of data and the aggregation of the data that you need. For example, if you want to understand how well e-scooters are functioning to deliver equitable access, well, you don't need to know every single trip to do that. You need to have zonal information, and you need to trust that information. So you have to have audit mechanisms, but you need to have general idea of how it's functioning in a zone. You don't need every data point that a scooter operator or micromobility operator can provide. But if you are interested in enforcing access restrictions, or in the case of speed, incidences where people are traveling at higher speeds or in unsafe ways, well, then you need data on that specific scooter and that specific incident. But you shouldn't need all the information about all scooters. You only need to know which scooters are in a possibly relevant incident. So that's already a very much smaller subset. And when you have that, then that data, you need to apply some very stringent type of data handling rules that you don't need to apply for other things. So that's the kind of data reporting pipeline, the data reporting asking and tasking mechanism that can help guide and reduce both the amount of data that's being asked for and increase, because of that, increase the trust that that data is going to be used to deliver a outcome that everyone agrees on, because it's based on a vision, it's based on a mandate. So that's the question, the more fundamental question. I think if we are able to address that and put in place systems that address that, then the type of data we need will naturally flow from that.
Indeed, this is much more efficient process in terms of, setting up your visions, your tasks, what you want the data to answer, and then you collect specific data that addresses these points, which is much more effective and efficient. That also perhaps also partly addresses Karen's questions about, capacity constraints, because perhaps they don't need such amount of vast raw data to be processed in-house in the public sector. Most of them are not data scientists, so they're not able to handle so much data points at the same time. So that's a very good point. Please.
They need to trust the data. They need to trust the information rather that they're getting, because they're not going to get raw data. They need to trust the information they're getting that's based on that. And what I said just in passing, the audit mechanisms is super important. And that's also something that in that ecosystem, third parties like Karen was talking about can help make sure that you can trust this data. It doesn't have to be necessarily the public authority getting all the data and making an assessment on something. They can trust other parties to give that validation.
Right, excellent point. Thank you very much. So let me come to you again to the mobility providers. So Bolt has been actively involved in this new mobility space, of course, and is Bolt supportive of having as many common indicators for mobility services as possible, or do you see any potential hurdles to uptake of these kind of common indicators across cities that you've seen just now? We presented a sort of initial list of different indicators that can be monitored or can be used for data reporting, for measurement, for policy advisory purposes. Are you supportive of having this kind of things?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the more common indicators across services that we can define, the better. I think there's a couple of indicators that are easily transportable across different modes, like the CO2 footprint of a particular service or a particular trip. But there's also differences, of course, between the services, because the data requests we get for our car sharing service is different than for our ride-hailing business or for our micromobility services. And we need to leave some sort of flexibility, of course, to allow for all of that. The potential challenge I see is exactly, I think, what Karen also shared, because Bolt operates particularly micromobility services in over 250 cities in Europe at the moment, and that ranges from very large cities with millions of inhabitants to cities of 10,000 inhabitants. And we see that different cities don't have the same kind of resources or monetary funds available to deal with data processing. And that leads to all kinds of challenges. So what Karen mentioned, like building that capacity and helping cities to build that capacity internally is absolutely essential, especially given that third-party aggregators, I think that it's a wonderful solution, but it's also a fairly costly solution for cities that are on a low and a tight budget. So it's not something that many cities can actually attain. So we'll need to start working on building that capacity in-house. And from Bolt's side, if there's anything we can do to contribute to that capacity building, we're very happy, of course, to contribute to that.
Thank you very much. Kungru, I'd like to ask you something related to this. So on multiple different points. So, for example, the public-private cooperation that Kakao Mobility is doing with the government, and also the balance between data sharing, privacy protection, and competitiveness. How can they be optimized or maximize the potential of these new technology-based mobility services while also enhancing the societal value at the same time? Could you elaborate a little bit on these points, please?
Try to start with the second question first, and I think Philip mentioned about the trust. Mm-hmm. I think it's very important when we sharing our data between the private to the public, because in case of the player in the business side, like us, data is one of the important asset of the company. Without data, we cannot play in the market. But so that's why we try to collect every kind of data from our services and make some a data infrastructure. We invest a lot of money and employ some data expert for that because data is very important. So it means that data is kind of not public good. It's in case of that, it is originated from the private side, but I think it has a two side because it is a private asset, but it also kind of point it is a public asset as well, because transportation, like mobility services, also have some kind of public services. Like, we know the public transportation is just belong to the public side, and the new mobility services such as car hailing services, car sharing service is also part of the like a transport. It has some point of the public side point. So that's why I think we have some balancing between the competitiveness of the business company and the social benefit from the data, and also the privacy issue. So when we sharing our data to the public authority, there should be trust that it enable the public authority just focusing on the public interest, not the private interest, not the private issues. So that's why I try to highlight the importance of the balancing between private issue and the social benefit and the competitiveness of the business side. And for regarding first question, and the data is just the big data, I think, and it's about the real-time data and personal data. So it has a lot of insight, actually, and using this kind of big data, we can identify how market working. For example, in case of the cacao mobility, we have like a big market share in Korean market, and using our data, government can check the situation of the mobility market in real time, actually. So, for example, in last year, like from April 2022, Korean government start to ease of the COVID-19 measures. After then, the demand for the mobility is surging. And so the tax demand increased in short time, but the supply did not increase. So there was like some crisis in Korea after easing of the COVID-19 measures. So after then, we actively communicate our government, the Ministry of the Land Infrastructure and Transport. We actively communicate the current situation of the market using our data. And after then, our government makes some new policy. It's called flexible calling policy, taxi policy. They introduced new kind of regime to make some reduce mismatch in the market. So I think the data is one of the biggest asset for making policy because it have lots of insight for the market. So in terms of this sense, in this sense, so cooperation between government and private sector using data is very important to make a policy in timely. So that's why I would like to address the sharing data. And in terms of sharing data, trust is very important. And sharing data with the government is, it means private sector can give a very big insight to the public policy side. Yeah, that's why I think it's very important.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. It's working to both ways. So effective data sharing can also help better policy making. Then better policy making can also help, the thrive of some of these services or industry development. So which is very important. So I do want to leave some time for the audience as well. So I'd like to use perhaps my 5 more minutes for myself to ask you one question each for a very quick sort of our look into the future. So talking about the future of the regulations and adaptations of the regulations in this changing environment. So perhaps 1 minute each, if you could keep that length, that would be great. So Karen, let me start with you first. What kind of innovative approaches, including business models or PPP, right, public-private corporations, and also subsidies, can city really explore to make these new mobilities services like commercially viable, but also align with this wider society goals?
Yeah, we see that the sector is starting a phase of consolidation. The venture capital has been burned, and they need to find a sustainable business model now. And we also know that there's no easy money to be gained to a sustainable mobility. So I think right now we have to see if we want to rely on those services as public authorities as well over time and make sure that they don't indeed disappear overnight. How can we also help them survive if we see that they positively contribute to our urban mobility ecosystem? And that's where we need to explore new types of public-private partnerships, maybe also subsidies if they help us reach our policy goals. And we see some interesting and encouraging examples emerging in that field. For example, in Flanders, a number of Flemish cities have explored the use of MaaS to subsidize certain trips in a MaaS environment if they tick certain policy boxes. Like, for example, if they offer a service to specific types of users which normally would not be able to afford those services, or if they offer a service in an area where there's a high level of car dependence and no public transport, then those trips will be subsidized by the public authority through a MaaS ecosystem. Or a public-private partnership in the region of Antwerp, where shared e-bikes are being deployed on a regional scale, because we know in urban cores we have many alternatives available, but in suburbia there's a higher level of car dependence. So how can we create a business case also in those contexts for micromobility? And there we see an interesting public-private partnership emerging. And a last example I'd like to mention are e-hubs, electro-mobility services coming together in hubs in cities, where cities also accept that they will partly have to subsidize, at least in the first years, those services to help them survive. And that maybe once the market picks up, they can, reduce those subsidies.
Thanks for these excellent examples. So Diana, in Mexico City, how do you plan to improve your regulatory measures to ensure this long-term viability of these dockless bike systems? For example, you mentioned in the beginning that were kind of vulnerable in terms of their market, and also enable their expansions into, let's say, the peripheral areas like Karen just mentioned for micro mobility systems.
Definitely, we have to recognize that there is an offered and there is a service or a system that the people is using. So we have to regulate for these people. We have to make regulations that protect, that make that kind of services persist, survive during the time, and definitely we have to trust in the data they are providing to us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Philippe, I would like to propose this data standardization question to you. So what can we expect in the future, in terms of standardized data formats for new mobility services and this broader mobility sector, right? And how can such standardization reduce, let's say, costs or enhance data collections or facilitate interoperabilities between different stakeholders? Could you enlighten us on this topic?
So is there one standard to rule them all? No, spoiler alert. But there are a lot fewer standards that we probably imagine exist now that would be helpful to incentivize. So there are standards in micromobility, MDS, GBFS, MDS 2.0, the Mobility Data Specification 2.0 that just came out a week and a half ago. All of these provide models to structure data that enable both operators to share data with authorities, but also allow authorities to communicate with operators in digital form what it is they want. Those are important, but can that specific example, MDS 2.0, help a rail operator? No, not yet, and probably never. You might see convergence in ride services. You might see convergences around other areas. But I think the main role for public authorities in this arena is to, when they license services, when they engage with operators to provide the ability for these operators to function in their territory, to incentivize the use of one or two or a smaller number of standards, and then to provide benefits for using that standard, and disbenefits if they come with another standard, or at least a higher hurdle to indicate that the standard is as good as the incentivized or preferred standard. So there is a public policy role in starting to reduce the field of standards and corral and herd, I don't think herd is the right word, but to move operators towards one set of standards for each type of service. In 50 years, will there be one standard? I don't think so. But there might be only 3, and that would be a huge change from today.
Thank you. Welmo? I will come to you about your reactions to what Philippe just said, and also how does Bolt envision the future of data sharing and reporting in this rapidly evolving mobility industry?
I think I can only concur with Philippe. I think MDS and GBFS are most used in the industry, and definitely would be great if we can keep relying on those, given that they're so commonly used across the industry. Maybe when it comes to data reporting and the future there, I think that will only increase in importance over the next couple of years. And what we also need to start thinking about is making this the effective standard. Whenever you operate with a shared mobility service in a city, the basic idea should be that you share specific data with the city. Now, maybe we need to think a step further as well. Shouldn't we share some of that data with the wider public? Because there's still a lot of pushback these days against certain types of shared mobility, whether it's in a specific area of the city or as a whole. And that is partly because people don't understand what's happening. They don't understand what the policy objectives are. They don't understand the kind of conversations that we as operators have with the city and vice versa. But we need to start creating accountability, especially when we're talking about awarding licenses to operators, to select few operators through a tender process, for example. And there's promises that operators make. We need to make sure that people that live in that city know what those promises are and have a way to measure if and how that operator actually delivers on the promises that they made. So that's, I think, a direction we should go in, particularly when we're talking about an industry that is going to consolidate more and more.
Thank you. So let me come to Kakao Mobility. So from your perspective, how can regulatory framework capture these emerging industries resulting from this convergence across different various mobility sectors amidst the paradigm shift towards a user-centric perspective?
Yeah, I think nowadays terms of the mobility is very popular because compared to the transport, mobility has some kind of point like it use digital technology a lot. I think that's one of the difference between mobility and transport. So it means that digital technology is have some characteristics like it has a very fast in terms of the development and the innovation. So it means when the technology are developed fast, it means there are lots of chance to introduce a new kind of mobility using that kind of technology. So it means that in the future, the government will face some challenging to how they identify this kind of new mobility and how they classify this kind of mobility into their regulatory framework. So that's why I think the government should understand the difference between mobility and transport And also, like it makes some some phenomenon, like they make some blurring lines between modes of the transport. For example, in nowadays, bus and taxi is a very we can consider it is a different mode, but after demand responsive transport introduced, the line between bus and taxi is getting be blurred and blurred. So after then, the government should introduce a new kind of regulatory framework for them. So I think this kind of situation will be accelerate in the future because of the technology advancements. So we should aware of this kind of situation to considering measuring new mobility and considering making new policy for the new mobility as well. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yeah, it needs to adapt to this kind of a convergence of the industry, and also when the divisions or the boundaries between different services or different sectors are getting more and more blurred. So regulatory needs to really adapt there. So I'd like to thank all the participants, all the panelists, for this insightful discussion, deepening our understanding on these challenges and also opportunities that arise at the advent of the new mobility solutions in our cities. So that's all with all my questions that are prepared for this discussion. Now I'd like to first come to Robin, and then I'll come to the Mr. over there.
Can I just clarify, does the session end in 1 minute? Seriously.
Sorry?
Does this session end in 1 minute?
I guess so, but we can stay for a couple of more minutes if you don't mind, yes.
So I feel like I have my back to you. That was fantastic, and I was listening raptly, and I think the whole need of this as an idea is incredibly important, and we should have done it a long time ago. So I'm going to go as quickly as I can. The idea that, so I won't be politically correct or polite because of speed. So I feel that these indicators, we're moving towards a multimodal world, which we're hoping, and what has been making me so angry over the last 10 years, and this set of indicators will persist, is we have private car are exempt. We don't discuss them, and all the research papers and the indicators, they are not comparable across all things. So it is I want to say, we need these indicators, and it is disastrous to not include indicators that how do private cars, how much CO2 do they do? How many private cars create accidents? What is there? That all of these things we're doing need to be matched against private cars. So you can't, the exceptionalism of new mobility that has been digitalized, I want to say that connected cars are now and coming, and they also will be digitalized. And as you pointed out, the fuzziness between, is this private, is it public, is it personally used, is it shared, is it going to be taxi or Uber? What's the difference, honestly? The difference between a shuttle and a bus. So we have to really get away from these things. When you come to policy then, the issue with policy is we've had 200 years of siloed categories, which we have now done policy. And so you and I have discussed this, and I think about the indicators. Policy should be based on public goals, which I would say would be risk reduction and policy benefits. So therefore, our collection of data and the policies that we write should be, what is the speed of this vehicle? Oh, it's over 30 kilometers an hour, 20 kilometers an hour, therefore it's dangerous and produces X, so therefore we're going to regulate based on speed, or we're going to regulate based on vehicle weight, or we're going to regulate based on how many people who aren't in your immediate family will use this vehicle, therefore we want to do maintenance. That we should really have policy goals that are based on risks and not, oh, I call this an e-scooter, which we Was an e-scooter a toy or was it a motorcycle? Because our regulations were written based on these old-fashioned silos, and if we want to go for innovation as we move ahead, we need to have our regulations based on risk and policy goals and not what we call them. So then when I'm Uber and I enter the market, I know what I'm entering. Like I know, oh, it says check, check, check. These are the things. And including like CO2 emissions, again with cars, and I've been saying this for a long time, why do bike shares not have, what's the business model behind bike sharing? As long as cities don't care if you take up no space and don't care if you don't pollute, I don't know what the business model is that we should be. So these are, you can see I'm ranting, these are things I care a lot about. So I would recommend that you really, and also delivery versus personal, versus passenger. We are seeing more and more things that are half the time the vehicle is used for delivery and half the time for passenger. So again, to the policy and the risk, policy goals and the risks, what is it? Why are we creating that regulation? And I can't agree more with Philippe around the, and also you, whose name I can't pronounce, I'm very sorry, around the data privacy issues. And we should be collecting the absolute rock bottom minimum, keep it for as little as possible, know why we're asking it. And I think you're doing that. So you're asking those questions, but be very, very careful about that. And when I was arguing with MDS 1.0, I was saying, would you ask a personal driver these questions? Would you require an owner of a personal car? And if we don't, when we go to the multimodal future, we're saying, oh, you rich people, we have a totally different set of policies and privacy protections for you. But you who are in shared transport, we have a whole nother realm of things happening. So we need to just think, this is transport, these are the risks that we're counting, these are the reasons we're asking these questions, and stop making personal versus private, commercial versus private, service versus delivery, and particularly not even put cars into the mix. Like, we don't even count them. There, I was fast.
Thank you so much for this excellent point. We have two gentlemen over here. Please, the microphone is coming on your way.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. A quick look at the report showed me that in measuring the new mobilities, we should include road safety, which is not in the book, in the report right now. And I mention this because, just to give you an example, in Mexico, road fatalities fell 14% in total from 2010 to 2021. I excluded 2020 because of disruptions. 14%. All of the road users reduced its fatality with the exception of one, motorcyclists. So in selecting which is the new mobility, the safety of that new mobility should be measured so that that is encouraged to use it or discouraged to use it, or take actions to avoid such problems. So I would appreciate if that issue is included. Thank you.
And if I can just add prior work that we did around micromobility, so one small component of all of these different new mobility, looked specifically at categorizing these vehicles on mass and speed. And then we came up with 4 categories, recognizing that some were less safe, some were inherently more safe because the kinetic energy in that vehicle and its use would be lower. And so I think that is a really important policy relevant differentiator. Mass and speed for safety. Another one that's important that we don't really touch on in this report is passive versus active. So is a mode generating some activity, physical activity, from a whole of society perspective, that's a good thing. If it's not, then it's providing a lot of accessibility benefits, but missing out on those health benefits. So there are a number of ways to slice the pie, and that's what we say at the outset of the report. But those are 2 elements, safety and overall benefits are really good differentiators.
Thank you, Philippe. So let me just take the last question here. I'm sorry, in the interest of time, and there's an excellent presidency reception now waiting for us. So I will leave that occasion also for, if you haven't got a chance to ask the questions, please also, come forward with talking with the panelists. Please.
Hello, my name is Christophe Henrier. I'm trying to put the people together with cooperation for 20 years. And I have one observation. We asked why some business cases didn't work. This was the beginning of the session. And the point that I would miss is I have seen a pattern, and this pattern usually is a pattern of control and of fear of losing control, I would say. And for me, it seems to be something serpent in the serpent brain, or in management education or something like that. You have those people not talking about control, they talk about purpose and being particularly smart and holistic and everything. But I fear a lot is about control. And having some children, what I can tell you is you have two parents and they try to control the child, and what comes up is a mess if they control too much. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about this, the behavioral point that in my opinion is destroying a lot in this field. How to do that?
Who wants to take this question?
I can just say three things very briefly. What matters most to policy is how vehicles are used, because that's where you have the behaviors, and that's where you generate demand. And those are two things: the behavior, the negative aspects of behavior, the good aspects of behavior, how vehicles are used, and how much, the volume of demand. So that's important. In order to get there, you need to understand both the number of vehicles that are out there, and so that's part of the work that we're trying to do, is to provide a way of categorizing those vehicles. And among those, there's some that are delivered in a different use case, a shared use case. So what I would say is that if you start from shared mobility services, shared new mobility is one of is a sub-element, a sub-case of overall vehicle use. And then in the end, you need to think about how vehicles are used and what demand. And they may be different from the shared case versus the owned case. So I think that's a kind of framework that you need to have in mind. Shared versus owned, and then what are the kinds of demand outputs, what are the kind of behavioral things that you can observe. And that, again, to be able to determine that, you need to have a common framework for measuring and collecting that information, which again, we don't have.
Please.
Can I add something a little bit more practical, very brief as well? What we have seen with the adoption of e-scooters at such a large scale is that a lot of people that have never used a bicycle before and just used public transport or a car suddenly got on small vehicles, which in itself is a very good development, right? More and more people taking to two wheels. Usually once they get used to an e-scooter, they also start exploring bikes, or they maybe walk more, use public transport more. There's all kinds of benefits. But it also means that there were suddenly a lot of people that were not trained to use these vehicles that were using them. And I think we need to start looking a lot more on how we can give people the skills to actually use these vehicles. And that means starting at a young age, teaching kids at school, not just to ride a bike, but also, or to walk safely in a city, but let's give them e-scooters to use so that by the time they can independently participate in traffic, they know how to do so.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As much as I want to continue the excellent discussions with all of you, I think we have to close this session. Thank you very much once again to all of you who participated and stayed here for these extra 10 minutes and for these dynamic discussions with all the panelists. I hope, after this we can continue the discussion offline. And thank you very much to all the panelists for your excellent contributions. This gives us the foundation of, thinking one step ahead of what we need to do really to concretize this regulation improvements to adapt to this changing environment. Thank you very much. So let's give all of our excellent speakers another round of applause. Thank you very much. And also thanks to all the technical support staff here. Without you, I think the session will not be so smoothly running. Thank you very much for your work behind the scene. And let's get ready for our presidency reception. So please, the shuttle bus is waiting for you in front of the entrance to the CCL. So they will take you directly to the venue for the presidency reception in the city center. It's called the Zoo. So I don't think you will see animals, but you will enjoy definitely the music and the drink.
or may not have Oasis as the band. We'll see.
Yes, thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. It was a great discussion.